Hey everyone, today's story is about a guy who gets kicked from the hero party right before the final battle. Heartbroken, he goes back home thinking everything is over. But after the party defeats the demon lord, they all come back looking for him. And this time they want to marry him. So with that said, let's begin the story. Lightning flashed across the kingdom's dark sky. An urgent meeting of the heroes party was taking place at the walls of the demon lord's castle. Reki, Yuri, and Ryushika stood side by side. The girls' faces were serious. Their friend Jean, completely unconcerned, approached, puzzled by the urgency of the gathering, thinking the matter concerned battle strategy. But he was wrong. The fair-haired girl Reki, who was standing in the middle, stepped forward and declared that in the name of the hero Reki Arius, she was expelling him from the party. The story flashes back a bit to the protagonist's past. The protagonist, Jean Geist, recounts how he left his home village alongside his childhood friend Reki, whom the goddess had blessed with the title of hero, to defeat the demon lord. A little later, two more girls joined the squad, Saint Yuri and Sage Ryushika. Together, they crushed the army of darkness across the world. And when they finally stood at the gates of the enemy castle on the day of the decisive battle, this conversation took place. Reki turned to Jean, asking him if he remembered their promise, to which Jean recalled the very words he had once spoken. Jean looked down thoughtfully and a little sadly, recalling his promise. He knew that this day would come sooner or later. With a sad expression, he said that he remembered his words. The fair-haired girl pressed her palms together and accepted his answer with a smile on her face. Jean recalled his blessing, early development. His skills grew quickly, but they also reached their limit just as fast. At the beginning of his journey, he had been useful. Memories surfaced of moments when he had fought confidently and protected Reki from enemies. Over time, everything changed. Battles became more frequent, and the protagonist noticed that against the backdrop of the saint, considered the embodiment of a goddess and a bestower of strength, the sage, keeper of secret knowledge and forgotten magic, and of course the hero, an indomitable warrior who swept away all evil with her power. He always stood out. No matter how much Jean trained, the gap between them only grew, and in the heat of battle, he increasingly became a burden to them. The girl's words snapped him out of his memories. Yuri said they would continue to carry out his will, and Ryushika added that Jean had been their best friend and that would never change. He thanked them, though his face wasn't happy. Rather, it was pensive. Reki stepped closer to him and said his name. He looked up and replied in kind. They gazed at each other. His hand rose and touched her light hair, gently ruffling the top of her head. He told her not to worry and that, together with the other girls, they would definitely overcome everything. Reki closed her eyes, accepting his affection. She replied that she had no doubts and that he should just wait, and then she would come for him as soon as they finished off the lord. The boy accepted her words, waved his hand, turned around, and walked toward the door. He said he was going to his room to pack his things. Ryushika and Yuri watched him go in silence. Before leaving, he paused. His thoughts wouldn't leave him alone. He understood that after their victory, the girls would become legends. He doubted that Reki's words could come true. Their situations would become too different, and even a simple conversation might prove impossible. Finally, he said he was happy to have walked this path with them. He turned to them and said, "Thank you," with a smile. His final words were an admission that, in truth, he would have liked to stay with them until the very end. The three girls stood silently, watching him. When he left the meeting room, Yuri said with a smile that it was time for them to go to their rooms. After getting an affirmative response from Reki, Ryushika exhaled and said she was going to go get some fresh air. A short while later, Reki was sitting in her room, hugging a pillow to her knees. She thought about how she had to finish off the lord as soon as possible, because every second counted. After all, she still had to pick out a wedding dress. In her daydreams, Reki imagined herself looking beautiful in a delicate white dress and planning a wedding that perfectly suited Jin's tastes. But before that, she wanted to take a walk with him through the city, just like in the old days, just the two of them. Reki lies on the bed, smiling as she thinks about this. She realizes that her new friends, Yuri and Ryushika, are getting in the way of her time with Jean a little, since they've barely managed to be alone together. Nostalgia for the past made her smile. After all, Jean had been her hero and protector since childhood. Reki remembered how they used to spend time together under a big tree, how she would cry, and he would comfort her with a smile. Reki was an outcast because of her unbridled strength, and he was the only one who gave her warmth. She remembered their conversations, where he'd say that he didn't care what others said, because he'd always be on her side. She'd ask him then if he was sure, and Jean would answer, "Of course." His words about how dear she was to him, like family, were etched into her memory. Then she would look at him and ask if he would marry her if she killed the demon lord. And he smiled and agreed, provided she hadn't fallen out of love with him by then. And then, on their pinky fingers, under a large tree on a hill with a beautiful view of nature, they made that promise to each other. Reki has cherished this memory since she was 5. Recalling his recent words, she realized that he remembered their promise, for it was for this very reason that she was still fighting. Falling back onto the bed and hugging her pillow, she spoke to him in her mind, expressing her fears. If something happened to him in battle, she wouldn't survive it. That was why she had asked him to leave the unit for just one day. Lying on her side and staring off into the distance, she smiled and wished him good night. And she told him she loved him. Meanwhile, Yuri's bed is empty. She stands in the shower, water dripping down her body, and gazing off into the distance with a languid look, she talks to herself in her head, having a mental conversation with Reki. Realizing her plan, she understands that her friend in the squad is going to quickly finish off the Lord and confess her love to Jean. Yuri closed her eyes under the stream of water and, apologizing to Reki in her thoughts, told herself that she had no intention of giving in to her. She remembers that her whole life she had been a saint, living only for her prayers, and no one understood her pain. Absolutely no one. Except for him. Once, in church, Jean came up to her and asked her to tell him about herself. The saint asked him in surprise, "Why are you so kind to me?" To which he replied fiercely that she was constantly praying for their salvation, but she herself had no one to lean on, and it seemed unfair to him. Yuri felt the light touch of his hand on hers and asked him if she could do that. Jean replied that she didn't need to ask for permission, and that if anyone dared to say anything against it, they would have to deal with him, because he wanted to help not the great saint, namely, Yuri. The girl looked at him and burst into tears of hope. Returning to the present, still standing in the shower, Yuri lathered her body and recalled Jin's passionate gaze. He had melted her frozen heart. The girl was drowning in her love for him. That day, she had only cried and couldn't utter a word, but now was the perfect moment to respond. Taking a towel from the basket, she recalls his sad gaze. She realizes that he must have decided everyone had abandoned him. The girl dries herself with the towel and, smiling, fantasizes about how Saint will use all her talents to comfort him. She decides to throw to the wind the vow of chastity she once made to the church, and the title of saint, too. At that moment, an image of Ryashika flashed through her mind, and she thought that this was what they both needed. She imagined how, after their victory, their unit would be disbanded, and because of the difference in their social statuses, it would be difficult for her to see Jean. But if he became the saint's husband, then neither the state nor the people would dare to harm him. And it would be easier for Reki to visit him, too. She could already picture herself in her mind, twirling in Jin's arms in a delicate dress. Angels would be flying around them, showering them with cherry blossom petals, while Ryashika and Reki stood behind them, looking displeased. Getting dressed. Yuri was getting ready to go into Jin's room. Her friends were surely busy, and this was the perfect chance to make her dreams come true. She entered his room with a joyful expression. She found the room empty, and looking around, she saw a note on the table. Crumpling in her hands, she stared ahead furiously. The realization hit her quickly. Ryashika had intercepted him. Somewhere in the village, the sage and Jean are standing. He thanks her for teleporting him straight to the village. She replies that teleportation is a piece of cake for her. To which Jean says in surprise that she had previously said this was the highest magic of a sage. Ryashika, with a gentle smile on her face, replies that it's not difficult for a friend, and besides, she's long wanted to see his homeland. She asks if he can show it to her, to which she receives an affirmative answer. Jean looks at Ryashika with a smile and says that she really did save him, and he wouldn't have been able to bear saying goodbye to the others. They walk down the road together. Jean says that she's always helping him out, and she laughs in response. Ryashika gazes into his eyes languidly with a sly smile and says that getting to know a friend better never hurts. He smiles a little sheepishly and agrees. He leads her down the road to his house, saying it's no palace, but invites her inside. The girl walks behind him. A shadow falls across her face, and with a dark smile, she whispers that something is about to happen very soon. A little earlier, Ryashika Eldia, an elf in her late 20s. Her friends had long since settled down, but she had thrown herself into her studies and completely forgotten about marriage. She only came to her senses when she had firmly established herself in the old maids' club. Ryashika recalls all of this with a jolt. Back then, she ran to her parents in tears, but it was already too late. No one ever came forward to marry her. Not even her status as a sage helped her, though, if anything, it repelled others. Ryashika decided to take her last chance and set off on a journey with the hero. She remembers how the four of them sat in the forest around a small campfire. To her, Jean was no different from the others. Once, she tried to joke about her marriage. But Jean, holding a mug of drink in his hand, looked at her in surprise. He said that he thought Ryushika was sensitive and beautiful. According to him, she would make an excellent wife. The girl stared at him in surprise. And then, sitting side by side with him, she said that if she never found anyone, he would have to marry her. He laughed and replied that he agreed, but only if she was okay with a guy like him. Her face flushed at his words. She simply couldn't help but fall in love with him. Stroking her neck, he said with a smile that he could always count on her, and thanked her for her help. Ryushika shyly covered half her face, hiding her blush. Jean also added that, in his opinion, he liked older women. And then Ryushika's like meter went off the charts. Watching his back as they walked along the road to Jin's house in the village, she gradually came back to reality, fantasizing that very soon this strong and gentle young man would be hers. When they reached their destination, a small house appeared before them. Jean lowered his head slightly, looking uncertain, but the girl snapped him out of his thoughts. She said with a smile that he had saved many people and that he should enter the house with his head held high. He turned to face her and thanked her for her support. He raised his hand and knocked on the wooden door with his knuckles. A voice came from the other side, saying that someone would be right there to open the door. A middle-aged man opened the door, asking who was there. Lifting his head, he looked at the young man in surprise. It was his son. Jean smiled at his father and said he was finally home. From the doorway, the father called out to his wife that their son had returned. Meanwhile, the mother was wiping down the table and couldn't believe her eyes as she looked at the door. The father pointed at Ryushika, asking who she was. Jean had already opened his mouth to introduce his girlfriend, but she spoke first. She bowed respectfully and said her name was Ryushika and that she was their son's fiancée. Jin's parents and Jean himself stared at her in surprise. His mother and father surrounded the girl, happily telling him how lucky he was to have her and how happy they were. Jean, meanwhile, was frozen in place. When the conversation turned to their future together, he decided to butt in. He asked excitedly, "What future are you talking about?" The girl's hand touched his shoulder, and she declared with confidence and a touch of assertiveness that she loved him. He waved his hands, saying that she hadn't even hinted at her feelings. Ryushika touched his palm. Catching his embarrassed gaze, she began to remind him of their conversation back then in the forest about their marriage. Jean fell into thought, and, blushing, he finally remembered that it had indeed happened. He exclaimed that without her, the other members of the squad couldn't handle the Lord. Ryushika stopped him, saying that she would return to them after spending one night with him. He didn't understand a thing. The girl was desperately trying to make him understand that she wasn't joking, that she loved him, and that she didn't need anyone else. Jean stood there completely baffled, thinking that Ryushika really was an incredible woman to him. But getting married right away was a step too far. He suddenly straightened up, and a thought flashed through his mind. He asked himself why not. The girl stood there, looking at him hopefully, hoping for a positive answer. Meanwhile, Jean was thinking to himself, will he ever have another chance to marry anyone at all? He looked at her, analyzing her. To him, Ryushika was beautiful, smart, calm, and simply perfect. He respected her deeply. With a blank stare, he realizes he'll never have another chance to marry such a goddess. Smiling at his parents, he takes her by the hand and says they need to step outside for a moment. He slammed the door as he stepped outside, and pressing her sharply against the wall of his wooden house in the backyard, he asked her under the moonlight if she was serious. The girl stammered, embarrassed. She replied that she was indeed serious. Looking into her eyes, he says that she is a dear friend to him and that he cannot yet say with certainty that he loves her. However, he wants to try to see her as a woman. He asked her if she was okay with this arrangement. She wiped away tears of happiness. She takes his hand and presses his palm against her cheek, closing her eyes. She calls him silly and says that he is all she needs. She reaches out to kiss him, but at that moment, a blow from an unknown force strikes him. The elflet cries out. Jean is sent flying to the side and crashes into the wall. Ryushika runs to the wreckage. At that moment, Reki and Yuri appear, also worried about him. The three girls look at Jean anxiously. One of them exclaims, asking who could have done this to him. In response, they tell her it was her doing. The girls argue. Ryushika glares at Yuri. The girl in a cassock says she'll heal him herself, since 2 healings at once would be useless due to neutralization. The elf glares at the saint, who is already smiling and fantasizing about how she'll heal him, and he'll kiss her in gratitude. The girls start arguing with each other. Each wanted to help him herself without anyone else's help. Reki tried to break them up. Tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, she leans over him to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Jean hears their voices. He mentally thanks them for their concern, but he also scolds them for their quarrels, because instead of arguing, They should have just healed him already. All three girls were hovering over him, peering into Jin's face. Each one called out to him, trying to bring him back to consciousness. That was the last thing he saw before losing consciousness. A couple of hours later, Jin opened his eyes. His head still ached. He looked around, trying to figure out where he was. It was his room. He felt a weight on top of him. Lifting the blanket, he saw that Yuri was sleeping on top of him, wearing only a nightgown. She was snoring softly, lying on her stomach between his legs. Memories slowly began to return to Jin. He recalled how Ryushika had confessed her feelings to him yesterday, and then Yuri had appeared out of nowhere, followed by a blow, and now he was unconscious. But he still couldn't figure out why she was in his bed. The girl began to open her eyes and stretch sleepily. Jin gave her a slightly awkward smile and thanked her for treating him. The saint sat in front of him on the bed and smiled gently. She asked what his plans were for the day, to which Jin replied that he was going to pray for them, since today was the day of the battle. At that moment, he realized it, and he rushed over to Yuri with questions about why she was here, and how Ryushika and Reki would manage without the hero's full squad. The girl replied that last night, at the Demon Lord's castle, Kaiser Raluel himself, the ruler of all dark creatures, appeared in his terrifying form before Reki and Yuri. The hero Reki, sword in hand, glared at him menacingly and gave him a choice: die now or die later. The Demon Lord, laughing at her, told her to attack, and he would fight her with all his might. Reki gripped the holy sword of justice tighter and struck, declaring that the power of love conquers all. Standing over the defeated lord, she asked, who was right in this war? Gasping for breath, he replied in a voice that didn't seem his own that the people were right in everything and victory belonged to them. It seemed he hadn't expected such words himself, and looked at them in surprise. Reki said that the purification had worked as intended, and Yuri added that from now on, the Lord would serve the people faithfully. The Lord tried hoarsely to voice his discontent, but the forces of light prevented him from doing so. He replied that he accepted his defeat and his fate. The girls turned to face the defeated Lord and told each other that there would be no more trouble with him and that they needed to return quickly. Returning a little earlier, after Jin had passed out, the sage Ryushika looked at Reki in bewilderment and exclaimed, surprised that she had been able to knock him out with a single blow. Reki rested her head in her hands, looked off to the side with a slightly sullen expression, and replied that she could have handled it on her own, to which Ryushika responded that she even felt sorry for Kaiser. Reki leaned wearily over Jin's bed and said that it had been harder for her when she woke up and Jin wasn't there, and that Ryushika was to blame for that. The elf smiled awkwardly. She said that all that remained was to report the victory to the king. Reki told her she could leave the report to her. The girl exclaimed in response that she couldn't go alone without the hero, and that she hadn't even been there during the battle. Reki furrowed her brows, glared at Ryushika, and said she didn't care and that she wouldn't leave Jin's side for a moment. Ryushika retorted that this was her heroic duty. Yuri joined the conversation. With a calm expression, she said she agreed with Reki. She added that Ryushika was a close acquaintance of the king and that she needed to sort everything out. Meanwhile, she'll keep an eye on Jin. The elf exclaimed, changing the subject, calling Yuri a bitch and saying she had too big a chest and was showing it off. Yuri asked in response, why are you being so rude? During the argument, Reki said that someone had to stay with Jin anyway, and that a game of rock, paper, scissors would settle the dispute. Returning to the present, Jin, now looking at Yuri, couldn't accept the fact that the Lord had been defeated. The saint smiled, and she said that the world was saved. Jin looked at his friend, and it dawned on him that the world was safe, and there was no longer any reason for them to be together, and it was time for him to become an ordinary person again. He gently placed his hands on Yuri's shoulders and said that the saint needed to return to the squad, since he was feeling better now and she didn't need to waste her time on someone like him. She stopped him, and she exclaimed in displeasure that it upset her when someone she cared about belittled himself like that. He looked at her in surprise and wanted to say something, but she stopped him. Jin exhaled and agreed with Yuri. She took his hands in hers and smiled. He still didn't understand how she had ended up in his bed. The girl, waving her hands in embarrassment, explained that she had only been watching over him and had fallen asleep. After a while, Jin went into the kitchen. The house was empty. On the table was breakfast his mom had made and a note. It said that mom and dad had gone out until evening, had prepared something energizing for them to eat, and in a postscript asked them to do their best there. The boy stared at the note in confusion. As soon as Yuri appeared behind him, he tore up the note so she wouldn't read it, and he scattered the scraps of paper in the wind using magic. He looked at her. The girl was wearing a cute maid outfit. He complimented her, saying it looked great on her. She shyly covered her red cheeks with her hands and thanked him for the compliment. The image of her in her nightgown flashed through his mind again, and he noted to himself that the outfit was revealing. Yuri wanted to make breakfast, but was already ready. Jean suggested they eat on the veranda since the weather was nice. Sitting at the table in the fresh air, they ate breakfast. He savored the taste of the food. Watching Yuri eat, he remembered how he and Reki used to constantly fight over food when they were kids. The girl sipped her tea and remarked that the morning was quite peaceful, and they hadn't had one like this in a long time. Jean agreed with her, noting how nice it is when peace reigns. After breakfast, the girl stretched and said she felt so much lighter. Jean smiled too, noting that life without outside stress is wonderful. Still sitting at the table, the girl asked Jean what he planned to do next. The guy thought for a moment and replied that he hadn't decided yet. But most likely, he would just live for his own pleasure. He planned to work in the fields, go hunting, and sometimes go fishing, simply doing the things he hadn't had time for before. He asked Yuri a question in return. She, shyly clasping her fingers, said that she would just like to sit and chat with him, and asked if he didn't find this moment magical. He smiled and agreed. Jean said that if it were up to him, he would spend all eternity with her like this. The girl said with a smile that they would get married soon, and that now they would always be together. Jean turned his head toward her in surprise, wondering. With her hands folded across her chest, she replied dreamily that she hadn't forgotten that day for a single second. When he asked her to marry him, she reminded him of how, on their first date, he had said with confidence that in a difficult moment, when she had no strength left, he wanted to be by her side and be her support. Yuri added lovingly that this wedding vow had saved her and that for her, tired of life and afraid to pray, it had been a ray of light. Jean was speechless. The saint rose from her chair, and approaching him, she said that she loved him and wanted to spend this life with him. Jean looked at her, embarrassed. He thought that after 3 years of friendship, he knew Yuri well. But looking at her now, he realized that wasn't the case. She said she could guess what Jean was thinking right now. She took his hand and led him away with quick steps. Jean didn't have time to think. Using her powers, she pulled him toward her, and they both fell to the floor. She looked at him with a smile. Jean tried to get up from her, feeling embarrassed, but she pulled him back toward her. Yuri whispered languidly in his ear that she was sorry for not being such a saint, and she added that she wanted to drag him into her swamp so deep that he wouldn't be able to live without her. The girl's words echoed in Jin's head over and over again, but it didn't seem to bother him. He buried his face in her chest and saw nothing. The girl gently touched his hair and asked if he could hear her heart beating. He didn't answer. His own heart was beating very fast, like crazy. He blushed at her sweet scent, and his thoughts were in a jumble. His hands were trembling, and he couldn't resist the temptation. Jin's hand was practically resting on her chest. Just then, they were interrupted by Reki's voice. She was glaring at them disapprovingly. The girl leaned on the railing above them and asked what on earth they were doing there. They immediately started explaining themselves, while Reki just stared at them. Reki sighed and accepted their answer. Yuri said with a smile that she had discussed everything she wanted to talk about with Jean and headed into the house. Jean held out his hand to stop her. Reki looked at him. She grabbed his shirt and pulled him toward her, looking down thoughtfully. After a while, Reki and Jean were lying on his bed, talking. Reki said that lying there with him felt nostalgic, as if they had returned to their childhood. He agreed with her, throwing his arms behind his head. The girl looked up emotionlessly. Jean felt awkward. He was about to explain himself, and had already started talking about Yuri when Reki cut him off. She began saying that Yuri was kind, that it was impossible to be angry with her, and that she was a great cook, and her breasts are bigger than hers. Jean agreed to everything, and she caught him on the last one. He jumped up, embarrassed, but she rolled onto her side and, smiling, said gently that she wouldn't give in when it came to her love for him. His heart began to race, and, surprised by this, he tried to push away these thoughts about his childhood friend. He immediately started thinking of something to change the subject and distract himself. He began to recall their childhood, how as little kids they slept in this bed, how she used to snuggle up to him, and then she'd roll off the bed, hugging a pillow. Reki smiled, remembering how warm he'd been. She said back then that such a move didn't work on her anymore when he put his hand on the top of her head. He agreed, saying that he couldn't compete with her anymore. Reki smiled, sitting down next to him. She said that now even her pinky finger would be enough to defeat Jean. He replied that, actually, he was a little offended. She suggested they have an arm wrestling match. He started to refuse, since he would definitely lose, and there was simply no point. Then Reki started teasing and goading him. Jean took the bait and agreed. Jean said he had his pride too, and that they should fight with their hands. Reki replied that she could easily rip his arm off, so it would be better to fight using just their pinkies. They locked pinkies. Reki told him to start when he was ready. gathering all his strength. He started with the words, "Let's go." Instantly, it became difficult for him, but not a single muscle twitched on Reki's face. She smiled and said he was cute when he tried, and with those words, she won the finger wrestling match. Jean was thrown aside. He crashed on a bed. The girl said she had won. He gave up. Her hand gently touched his forehead. Reki told him not to get discouraged because strength isn't what matters most in battle. She added that a loss is a loss, and his punishment would be her next move. Reki leaned over him, interlacing their fingers, and looked into his eyes. She asked him why he had stopped sleeping with her. After all, they had always slept together on their travels before. Jean looked up at her in bewilderment. He replied that it was because she was already an adult. He tried to break free, but she held him tightly against the bed. She said anxiously that she didn't care about that. Looking at the embarrassed Jean, she asked him to sleep together again, just like before. He started to refuse, because it's wrong for a guy and a girl to sleep in the same bed without being in a relationship. In response to his words, Reki asked if he saw her as a girl. All the moments with Reki flashed before his eyes. How she sleeps next to him, how she hums a tune, how she looks at him and smiles. He looked at her and asked himself the same question. He also remembered how he used to ruffle her hair. To him, Reki had always been like a sister. He didn't say anything back to her, but the girl still said with a sweet smile that she was very happy. He had already started to speak, who she was to him, but he didn't get the chance. She leaned in very close to him and kissed him. The kiss was brief. She stood up and, folding her hands together, said she was happy that he finally saw her not as a little sister, but as a woman. She touched her face and said that she had finally stopped being her. Jean sat up after her. She said that now she wouldn't be somewhere behind him, but right beside him. And since that was the case, they would leave it at that for today. Reki got out of bed and looked at him. He couldn't take his eyes off her either. He told himself to stop lying to himself. And he realized that he loved Reki. She turned away, embarrassed. He thought that she had tried so hard for his sake and that he needed to respond to her feelings somehow. But there was one problem. At that moment, a voice rang out from the hallway. Ryushika and Yuri were back. He wondered what to say to Reki, since, besides her, two other girls had confessed their love to him. Ryushika walked in, exhausted, complaining to Jean that she'd ended up having to do everything herself. Jean covered his face desperately with his hands. He thought it would be strange to start a relationship with Reki, since he hadn't even mustered the courage to respond to those two. Ryushika interrupted his thoughts, asking if something had happened between them. The girls noticed Reki's embarrassed blush and exclaimed in front of her, asking questions. Ryushika and Yuri teased her. Ryushika said, "Who would have thought our Reki was so innocent?" And Yuri added, "She's all grown up now." The girl shut them up and asked if they had done everything. The elf replied that she had handled all of it, which was why everything had gone smoothly. Jean asked about their business. Yuri replied with a smile that they had been choosing a wedding venue. Jean looked at the saint and the others in surprise. He awkwardly replied that he congratulated them, but in reality, he didn't understand a thing. He wondered who was marrying whom. The girls turned to him and said it was obvious. They stood in front of him and, smiling, all three said at once that they were marrying Jean. He froze, staring at them. Reki, Yuri, and Ryushika stood nearby, watching Jean. He looked confused. What was happening surprised him greatly. Reki confidently declared that the venue for their wedding with Jean had already been chosen. These words confused him even more. He didn't understand why all three girls were discussing their wedding with him at once. Ryushika smiled gently. She turned to him and suggested that he was worried about each of their feelings. Her words made him think. In his mind, he agreed with her. And he couldn't believe that all three had decided to marry him at the same time. Jean was sitting at the table. Reki was seated to his left, and Ryushika was seated to his right. Yuri was behind him and suddenly touched his back. He jerked back and demanded that they stop acting that way. Reki just smiled. She calmly replied that they should be closer to their future husband. Those words made him feel even more embarrassed. He stepped back and sat down across from them. Then he ordered the girls to sit in front of him. Without objection, they took chairs and complied with his request. Jean sat in front of the girls, replaying their words in his head. It was as if an image of all three of them appeared before him at once. Judging by Ryushika's words, each of them knew about the other's feelings. This only made the situation even more confusing. He felt tension and wariness because something else was important right now. He looked closely at the girls. Reki was watching him a little more intently than the others. Her face showed a look of concentration. Ryushika was smiling gently, as was Yuri. Jean realized he had to be completely honest with them. He stood up from the chair in front of the table. His gaze swept over each of them once more. In his mind, he noted that standing before him were girls with whom he could spend the rest of his life. He realized that they had confessed their feelings to him. He continued to study their faces. Even if he remained silent now, they would likely stay by his side anyway. They had come a long way together. He understood that he couldn't do this. Standing in front of the table, he earnestly asked them to listen to him. The girls visibly tensed up. Ryoshika, despite this, asked with a slight smile why he looked so serious. Jean remembered that he and the elf had already discussed this the day before. Then he decided to start by apologizing to Yuri. She asked in surprise, "Are you talking to me?" He confirmed it and explained that the words she had taken as a confession had not been spoken out of romantic feelings at the time. Yuri looked at him in surprise. Then he added that he wanted to apologize to Reki as well. The girl immediately tensed up. He admitted that he had only just understood the meaning of her words. It was about that promise. He realized she was referring to the childhood vow they had once made to each other, linking little fingers. Jean leaned his hands on the table. He couldn't imagine that Reki had kept that childhood vow all these years. He himself had made the promise without realizing its weight. He asked for forgiveness. The girls visibly tensed up. He kept talking. Jean admitted that he didn't believe in himself. He didn't have the strength to fight on equal footing with them. He really wanted to proudly call himself their comrade. Warm memories came flooding back. He recalled how Yuri had smiled beside him, how Ryoshika had sat by the campfire with a mug in her hands, enjoying the evening, how he and Reki had walked through the forest together, how they had all fought side by side. He said that it was precisely this pain that had forced him to leave the squad. The thought that he wouldn't be able to share the joy of victory with them was eating him up inside. Back then, he thought he could no longer reach them. But even after the battle, they stayed by his side. They spent time together not as a squad of heroes, but as ordinary people. Jean dropped to his knees before them. He wanted it to be like this forever. He wanted to spend his life with them. Gathering his strength, he announced his decision aloud. Jean asked all three of them to marry him. His voice was full of determination. He said he wanted to make each of them happy. The girls looked at him shyly. Joy appeared in their eyes. Jean swore he would make them happy. He addressed each of them. He clenched his fists and admitted that he was unable to choose just one. Jean didn't know if society or the king would accept this. He decided he would think about it later. The girl smiled gently. He said he loved them all, so he asked each of them to become his wife. A few seconds passed. The logs crackled quietly in the fireplace. Reki suddenly couldn't hold back a giggle. Ryoshika and Yuri started giggling next. All three of them laughed. Jean looked up and stared at them in confusion. He didn't understand what was going on. Yuri, still laughing, apologized and said he looked too serious. Jean didn't understand what was so funny about that. He thought he'd been completely serious. At that moment, Reki touched his forehead with her index finger. She smiled and calmly said that he wouldn't be able to choose one of them, and they had known that for a long time. Her gaze radiated confidence. She added that he shouldn't dare underestimate her 10 years of experience in love. Jean felt embarrassed and looked at her. Reki continued, saying she was a little hurt that he hadn't understood her feelings sooner. He apologized awkwardly. Reki immediately replied that she forgave him and hugged him tightly. They ended up on the floor. She held him close and sat on top of him. A warm smile was on her face. She told him not to be downhearted. A memory from the past came to mind. He remembered a time when he went for a walk with Reki. Back then, she was truly happy. The girl confessed that he had always warmed her heart. Yuri approached them and sat down next to them. She said she felt the same way. According to her, his support had once lifted her heart out of the depths of despair. She gently touched the top of his head and ran her hand through his hair. She added that she had been able to make it this far only because he had been by her side. Jean lowered his head. His eyes began to fill with tears. He quietly said their names. At that moment, Ryoshika approached. She asked him to look at them. She took his hand in hers and said that from the very day they had fallen in love with him. The answer had been obvious to them. All three of them sat next to him. They touched him, hugged him, and stayed close. Together, they said they agreed. Jean couldn't hold back his emotions. He burst into tears, and he began to thank them. He was overwhelmed with emotion. After a while, Reki looked down at her clothes. The fabric was soaked from his tears. Jean immediately apologized. The girls returned to the table with him. Yuri said it was the first time she'd seen him like that. Ryoshika noted that he'd finally stopped pretending to be strong. Jean replied that anyone would have lost control with such happiness. Reki noted with a smile that he was very embarrassed. He sat there with a red face. Jean said he would definitely make them all happy. He promised to do his best for the four of them and asked them to trust him. The girls closed their eyes and agreed with a smile. Reki added that he shouldn't worry. Jean was surprised and didn't understand what she meant. Ryoshika reminded him that the wedding venue had already been chosen. He immediately remembered and asked, "Where exactly?" Reki replied that it was at the royal castle. Jean was in shock. He stood up, unable to believe what he'd heard. He didn't understand how this was possible. He said that even a regular marriage is hard to arrange, let alone something like this. Ryushika calmly explained that for ordinary people, it's impossible, but their case isn't ordinary. Yuri added that for this, he would have to become a nobleman. The girls looked at him defiantly. Jean stood there completely bewildered, not understanding what was happening. The kingdom of Mio stretched out among the high mountains. Stone walls surrounded the city, forming a closed circle. Gates towered over the roads leading inside. Beyond them stretched streets lined with houses where people lived. A castle stood in the center. Its towers rose above the city. In the distance, mills and mountain slopes were visible. Jean looked at this place and pondered. He couldn't believe that an ordinary person was capable of marrying a hero. Such a thought seemed impossible. He recalled the capital of the kingdom of Mio. The castle of Eldenturk came to mind. The tall towers, spacious courtyards, and mountains in the background created a majestic scene. He continued to ponder. Even a single such union seemed unbelievable. And the thought that a saint and a sage would also be there seemed like something out of a fantasy novel. His thoughts were interrupted. They were inside the castle. Knights stood in the great hall. A solemn atmosphere reigned. A loud voice rang out, ordering silence. Everyone froze. The king was in the throne room. A fair-haired man with a mustache and beard stood before the throne. A crown rested upon his head. Knights lined up on either side of him. Reki, Yuri, Ryushika, and Jean stood before the king. An announcement was made regarding his majesty's arrival. It was King Ulval Mion. Jean knelt before him, unable to comprehend how he had ended up in this situation. He bowed and thanked the king for the honor. Then he introduced himself and reported on his safe return. The girls also bowed before the ruler. He apologized for his audacity and sudden appearance. The king ordered him to raise his head. Jean obeyed. The next moment, the king's expression changed. He smiled broadly and suddenly embraced him. Jean froze in surprise. The king joyfully called him his dear godson. He said he was glad to see him alive and unharmed. The girl stood in complete shock, not understanding what was happening. Jean awkwardly returned the king's embrace. The thought flashed through his mind that the current ruler of the kingdom was standing before him. Reki rested her face on his arm. The king bared his teeth and narrowed his eyes. Behind Jean, the girls took a step forward. Reki was the first to address the king, demanding indignantly that he stop standing so close to their husband. Ryushika added with a smile that he would soon start smelling of old age. Jean immediately tried to stop them and asked them to show at least a little respect. The king smirked in response and remarked that it seemed only Jean loved him. The knights standing on either side watched the scene unfold awkwardly. The king changed his tone and reminded them that they had arrived only a couple of hours ago. He noted that gathering people for an audience wasn't so easy. The saint explained that they had managed to arrive quickly thanks to Ryushika. The king immediately reprimanded her and told her not to go around teleporting willy-nilly. Jean looked around. Thoughts of the kingdom of Mio came to mind. It was one of the two states that divided the continent. Here, a strong monarchy coexisted with the citizens' freedom and autonomy. It was precisely for this that the people valued their ruler. He continued to reflect. Their expedition had been made possible thanks to the support of the crown. They had been provided with equipment, money, and training. He was grateful for that. Memories surfaced of moments when he sat at a table learning to wield a sword and magic. He recalled that King Ulval was called a great diplomat. He had managed to unite different states and races. The alliance with the church and the lands of the elves was his achievement. It was precisely because of this that the squad was able to assemble in this configuration. A conversation from the past came to mind. Back then, the king had stood next to the still young Jean and held him by the shoulder. He had said that Reki needed someone who would be her support. He added that if it became too difficult, Jean could leave, but for now he had to look after her. An image of the young Reki, learning to wield a sword, appeared before his eyes. Jean understood that Ulval was aware of the heavy burden resting on her shoulders. He returned to the present. The king looked at them and asked what they meant by their words about a husband. He asked directly if they had come to ask for this. Jean replied that he was happy the girls loved him and that he himself sincerely wanted to marry them. He bowed his head slightly and admitted that becoming a nobleman seemed like a distant dream to him. The king fell into thought, and he asked the girls if they had explained everything to him. They exchanged puzzled glances. Then the king bluntly called them foolish. Yuri explained that they knew about each other's feelings and understood that neither was willing to back down. Reki added that they were pleased that Jean had taken this seriously. Then she continued and said that if they started fighting over him, nothing would be left of the country. A picture of destruction flashed through Jin's mind. He immediately believed her words. The king confirmed that he could easily imagine it. Ryushika calmly added that they had discussed everything in advance. They decided that the only option where no one would get hurt was to be together. She explained that polygamy was permitted for aristocrats, depending on their title. Reki confidently declared that they simply couldn't forbid their wedding. She looked at Jean and made it clear that he couldn't escape this decision. She called him her husband. The girl stood nearby. Yuri smiled. Reki looked straight at him. Ryushika calmly watched his reaction. Jean blushed and looked flustered. He couldn't find the words. In his mind, he realized that while he'd been racking his brain, they'd already decided everything long ago. Jean looked at the girls in bewilderment and said that he understood everything now, but that nobility was granted only for great deeds, and he wasn't sure if this was right for him. Yuri calmly replied that he was wrong to doubt it. With a slight smile, she reminded him that they had defeated the demon lord. The king confirmed that this was a great feat for the entire country. Jean pressed his fist to his chest and thanked him. He said he was glad to hear that, but he added that the girls deserved most of the credit. There was a hint of sadness in his voice, for he had not taken part in the final battle. The king looked at him silently. Then he said seriously that many recognized his contribution. He spoke on behalf of the people and noted that in dark times, the squad's successes had become a ray of hope. Jean looked up in surprise. The king added that he had played a part in that as well. He emphasized that Jean had been an indispensable part of the team. An image of their squad flashed through Jin's mind. The king extended his hand and solemnly declared that Jean had fulfilled his duty with honor. Silence fell over the throne room. The knights stood motionless. Jean covered his face with his fist and thanked him. The king placed a hand on his shoulder and said that the whole country would support their wedding. A short while later, they found themselves in the courtyard of Jin's house. It was a warm evening. A large table had been set up in the backyard. Platters of food were arranged on it. Pies, turkey, stew, bread, and other treats. Jin's father raised a large mug of beer and loudly proposed a toast to Jean. The girls raised their mugs as well. Jean reacted with embarrassment and said it was too early for such words. Everyone began to eat. Reki said that their union was now approved by the crown. Yuri added that formally, it wasn't finalized yet. Jean reflected on the fact that there were still many problems in the country. They would have to wait. Jin's mother said with a smile that she was happy to see the brides in the house. The girls blushed and repeated the word, covering their cheeks with their hands. Jean blushed. His father watched the scene with interest. Yuri said dreamily that she had always wanted a wedding in a castle. Ryushika added excitedly that she couldn't believe she'd be wearing a wedding dress. Reki confidently declared that she had always known she would marry Jean. Their mother asked them with a tender smile to take good care of her son. Then she turned to Reki and said she was glad she had made friends. Reki nodded with food in her mouth and thanked her. After that, with a touch of playfulness, she asked if they should call her mom now. Yuri and Ryushika exchanged surprised glances. The saint praised the food and said the soup was very tasty. The elf added that the flavor was exquisite. The mother blushed and thanked them. The father put his arm around Jin's neck and asked with a smile how he'd managed to find such girls. He joked and told them not to let them down and to behave with dignity. Jean chuckled quietly. They stepped aside and stopped by the fence. Jean admitted that he had expected to be scolded. He reminded him that he had promised to protect Reki, but in the end, he had left her. He lowered his gaze. His father replied that he had indeed thought about that at first, but when he saw him, he understood everything. The memory of his son's return home came flooding back. He said that Jean had been through a lot and had made difficult decisions. They looked back. The girls were laughing at the table. Reki was trying to take Ryushika's plate away. Yuri was smiling, leaning over the table. His mother was laughing too. His father said that his comrades respected him and truly loved him. He chuckled and added that his son was lucky. Jean smiled and offered him a drink. His father replied that he should drink too, since he was already an adult. Jean agreed. He sank back into his thoughts. In the morning, he had been filled with fear, but now his heart was racing with anticipation. He looked at the mug in his hands. A picture of the wedding flashed through his mind. Jean was walking down the aisle in front of everyone. One of the brides was by his side. He took a sip. He turned to the girls. He asked, in what order would they walk down the aisle? After all, it would be strange for everyone to walk together. Reki looked at Jean with a slight squint and smiled. She called him a joker. Ryushika casually touched her face with her hand and said thoughtfully, which one of us is worthy of being the first wife? Yuri eagerly picked up on this idea. All three declared at once that they should be the first. They looked at each other in surprise. The next moment, each of them prepared for battle. Ryushika gathered magical power around herself. Reki gripped the hero's sword tightly. Yuri summoned her sacred weapon. The tension mounted. It seemed they were ready to attack one another. Jean quickly stepped between them and tried to stop what was happening. Meanwhile, in the Demon Lord's castle, a girl was running through the corridors. She burst into the hall and, breathing heavily, turned to her father. She demanded an explanation. It was the demon princess, Hina. The former demon lord looked at her calmly and asked what had happened. Hina couldn't contain her emotions. She asked what had become of the demon's great goal. He remained calm, and with a slight smile, he replied that they should forget about conquering the world. He called it a mistake of the past and declared that demons must live in peace with humans. Hina couldn't believe it. The image of her father as he used to be flashed through her mind. A cruel and powerful ruler. She didn't understand where the man she knew had gone. Images of heroes came to mind. Reki, Yuri, Ryushika, and Jean. She was certain that everything had changed because of them. She believed that after being struck by the holy power, her father had been transformed. She couldn't accept that the Lord of Demons had become so calm. Meanwhile, he held a broom in his hands and suggested they clean up the castle together. Hina looked at him in confusion. She agreed, but inside she had made a different decision. She swore to destroy the heroes and bring back her old father. The next moment, she spread her wings and flew out the window, shattering the glass. She soared rapidly into the sky. The former demon, Lord Watcher Go. His face grew serious. He quietly uttered the name Perura. His advisor appeared behind him. She knelt down. He ordered her to keep an eye on Hina. He noted that she understood people better than anyone else. Pararuka replied that she already knew where the princess was headed. She assured him she would carry out the order. He asked, "Where exactly?" She replied that she was heading to the kingdom's capital. At that moment, Hina was flying toward the city. Her wings sliced through the air. Demonic horns stood out on her head. Her light hair fluttered in the wind. Her gaze was filled with fury. Her pupils resembled those of a cat. She was certain of her decision. In her thoughts, she addressed the heroes, and she vowed to make them feel fear. A few days after the audience, life in the capital went on as usual. People hurried about their business. Merchants loudly called out to customers, and the streets were full of noise and movement. Hina walked among the crowd. Her face was hidden by a cloak. She looked around the city intently. In her mind, she noted that she had finally made it to the capital. It seemed to her that people were deliberately throwing her off course with their magic, though in reality, that was not the case. She looked away with contempt, and she thought how many pathetic people there were here. She moved through the crowd, trying not to attract attention. The thought that it would be easy to cause a commotion here flashed through her mind. But she held back. She couldn't reveal herself, not until she got what she wanted. A cold smile appeared on her face. She chuckled quietly. Meanwhile, at Jin's house, he was sitting at the table with the girls. He declared in all seriousness that they needed to build their own house. The girls looked at him in surprise. Reki didn't understand why they needed to do that. After all, they were already doing just fine. Ryushika was also surprised by the suggestion. Jin admitted desperately that he couldn't go on like this anymore. He asked how many times their parents had already seen them all sleeping together. That moment flashed through his mind, and he felt embarrassed. He asked how they even managed to sneak into his room. Reki immediately pointed at Yuri. She got upset and called her a traitor. The elf calmly added that they had done it together. She asked them not to shift the blame onto each other. Jin pointed out that Ryushika had been involved too. Yuri said she supported the idea and that they needed their own space. Reki agreed with her. Ryushika immediately took the initiative. She spread out a sheet of paper on the table and began planning. She said they first needed to choose a plot and figure out the layout. Then she added that it was important to calculate the load. Jin watched her intently. The elf looked up thoughtfully and said that the main issue was the number of children's rooms. He immediately tensed up. Yuri suggested putting 2 in each room. Ryushika calmly added that 15 rooms should be enough. Jin looked at them with a grim expression and asked how many kids they were planning to have anyway. He walked over to Reki and covered her ears, trying to stop the conversation. He said he wanted to take everyone's wishes into account, since they were a family now. But Ryushika was already enthusiastically continuing to talk about their future home. Yuri added that a separate room wouldn't hurt either. Jin covered Reki's ears even tighter and couldn't understand why the conversation had veered in that direction again. While the girls were discussing this among themselves, the saint said that Jin was always kind, and she'd like to see a different side of him. Ryushika added that she, on the contrary, liked his gentleness. Jin couldn't take it anymore and pulled Reki aside. He suggested they go out for some fresh air. They ended up in the backyard. Silence hung under the tree. They sat down next to each other and took out their mugs. He offered her some tea. She agreed, and she leaned against him. He asked if the drink was too hot. She shook her head and said that everything was fine. She leaned her back against his chest and quietly admitted that she had been waiting a long time for moments like this. He gently stroked her head and said he'd wanted this too. Reki turned to him and asked him to braid her hair. He agreed with a smile. She closed her eyes and said that now she wanted to live like a normal girl. She added that she could allow herself to be vulnerable when she was with him. It was peaceful all around. Berçant soufflé. A light breeze rustled the leaves. The sun peeked through the clouds. They sat side by side, enjoying the moment. He carefully braided her hair and secured it. Then he said it was all done, and she looked cute. She turned to him, and with a slight smile, she remarked that she was already cute. But now she looked even better. He blushed. She hugged him, and said that now she could do it as much as she wanted. Day and night. Jean quietly replied that they didn't need to be shy anymore. Jean added with a smile that he, too, had dreamed of moments like this. Reki looked at him shyly. Her cheeks flushed. She lowered her gaze and pressed herself closer to him. She said quietly that he rarely took the initiative. But that was exactly what she liked about him. For her, it was a special kind of happiness. At that moment, Yuri suddenly appeared beside them. She waved her arms and ordered them to stop. Ryushika followed. She calmly added that acting alone was forbidden and repeated it once more. Yuri explained that she'd sensed a strange atmosphere and decided to check what was going on. Jean asked in surprise, "What kind of feeling is that?" Reki turned away in annoyance and continued hugging him. She muttered quietly that they'd ruined everything. Yuri was indignant and said that they were busy with their work, and now this was happening. Jean replied that they had gotten carried away with their own ideas. Ryushika unfolded a large sheet of paper and showed them the blueprint. Jean looked at it and was surprised. He noted that such a large-scale plan, completed in such a short time, looked impressive. The elf said with a slight smile that it was her work. She added that everything had been settled with the workers as well. At that moment, two bone dragons appeared nearby. Their bodies looked like skeletons, and their heads resembled those of dragons. Ryushika calmly explained that the demons were under her command and would help with the construction. She said the house would be ready in about 2 weeks. Jean was surprised by such speed. She added that these creatures don't need rest, and they were intelligent enough to perform complex tasks. Jean exhaled and thanked her. Ryushika took his hand and rested her head on his shoulder. She said that a good wife should help her husband. He looked at her, embarrassed. On the other side, Reki snuggled up to him and declared that she would help too. The saint appeared in front of him and hugged him, saying she wasn't going to be left behind. Jean looked at them. Ryushika was grinning. Reki was looking at him with an innocent smile, and Yuri had her eyes closed and looked content. He felt a surge of determination, and he said it was time to get to work. The girls readily supported him. Reki folded her arms across her chest and declared that she needed to be fed first so she could work at full strength. The other girls laughed. Jean smiled and suggested they cook something special. They returned to the table in the courtyard. Jean suggested cooking a roasted 4-legged bird. Ryushika explained that it was a local mountain bird with 4 legs and tender meat. Reki immediately took an interest. She happily said that it was her favorite dish. The elf asked her not to interfere. Jean asked Yuri to bring a cutting board. She agreed and started looking for one. Approaching Ryushika, she teased her with a slight smirk. Ryushika gave her a disapproving look and warned her. The saint brushed it off with a joke, then received the board, and she walked away, muttering quietly to herself. Jean got to work. He made an incision along the bone, carefully separated the meat, and trimmed off the excess. Then he cut it into pieces. He worked confidently, rolling up his sleeves. He added salt and pepper. Ryushika came closer and said they should add some local spices. Jean agreed, and he showed her some small garlic cloves. He explained that if you crush it, the aroma will become stronger. For the batter, he used eggs, yam powder, and flour. Ryushika watched with interest and remarked that he was a good cook. Jean replied that he enjoyed it. Then he called out to Yuri. She was sitting by a large pot of oil, stirring it. She said the oil was already hot. Jean paused for a moment and looked at her. He noted to himself that they had cooked together many times before. It had become routine. Yuri added that things felt different now. After all, it wasn't just work anymore, but a shared endeavor between close friends. Jean looked at Yuri and said that she was probably right and that it would be like this for the rest of their lives. She calmly replied that that was exactly how it would be. Then she walked up behind him and pressed closer. A mischievous smile appeared on her face. She added that they would be working hard together at night, too. Jean immediately felt embarrassed. He felt her pressing against him and tried to stop her. He called her by name. In response, she started tickling him and giggling softly. He tried to pull away and said they needed to cook. He picked up the chopsticks and began dropping pieces of meat into the hot oil. It sizzled. Reki and Ryushika immediately caught the aroma. They said the smell was very appetizing. Yuri noted that the dish would be ready soon. The elf asked Reki to be patient for a little while. Then the saint turned to Jean. He used the smoldering spark, spell, and added fire to the cauldron. The oil began to boil more vigorously. Now, they had to catch the exact moment. Reki, Ryushika, and Jean watched closely. The responsibility for this lay with Yuri. She listened for the sound. At the right moment, she realized it was time and cried out. They took out the meat and began setting the table. Dishes appeared: a vegetable salad, egg soup made with quadruped broth, roasted meat, and thin pancakes. Various ingredients and spices lay on the table. Yuri said everything was ready. The girls reacted joyfully. They laid out the cutlery, folded their hands, and gave thanks for the meal. Then they wished each other bon appetit. Reki was the first to take a bite. Everyone watched her expectantly. She began to eat with relish and said that the flavor was rich. The elf added that the crust was crispy, while the meat remained juicy. Yuri noted that the cooks would be pleased to hear that. Jean laughed at first, then said that it was worth the effort just for that reaction. Reki continued to eat with great appetite. Ryushika called her out on it and told her not to rush. Yuri added with a smile that there was enough food for everyone. Jean watched them and thought about what was happening. He told himself that he loved to cook, but in reality, he had simply honed this skill during the war. His thoughts were interrupted. With her mouth full, Reki addressed everyone. She said she loved them very much. Jean looked at her and thought to himself that he wanted to see her smile more often. At that moment, he heard a strange sound. He looked up. Ryushika noticed it too and said it sounded like a letter had arrived. Jean was surprised and asked how that was possible. She explained that it was a small-scale teleportation. With this, objects could be sent over a distance along a magical trail. Jean noted that it sounded too precise. The elf looked closely at the seal on the letter. Her expression grew serious. She recognized the green crest. She said it was a letter from Olvold. Jean and Yuri looked at her in surprise, while Reki continued to eat calmly. A short while later, everyone was in the king's private office. They stood before him and looked at him. Olvold was sitting at his desk in a large chair. He looked at them and said he was glad to see them. Reki looked away in annoyance and said they'd had a wonderful time. Olvold tried to calm her down with an awkward smile and said that the official announcement would come later. Then he added that the date of their wedding had already been set. The girls immediately became interested. Olvold informed them that preparations would take about a month, as bureaucratic matters had taken a lot of time. He clarified that the wedding would take place right in the royal castle. Jean imagined workers preparing the venue and decorating it. He smiled awkwardly and said it was a bold decision. Ryushika added with a serious expression that there was an advantage to it. She explained that, by acting as the patron of the hero's marriage, the kingdom would be able to deter other countries. She also noted that combining the wedding with a triumphant return would secure the people's support at minimal cost. She added that the joy of victory over the demon lord would drown out any potential discontent. She confidently held up 3 fingers to emphasize her words. Olvold folded his fingers and said that the country needed funds to recover from the demon invasion, so the plan was indeed a good one. Jean looked at Ryushika in surprise and thought that he had previously considered this mere entertainment. Olvold added seriously that the whole world would be watching this wedding. He declared that the kingdom of Mio would organize everything at the highest level. Then he noted that foreign delegations wouldn't have time to prepare on such short notice. Yuri stood by the window, through which the castle towers were visible. She gently interrupted him and said that this was actually for the best. She explained that the enemies wouldn't have time to act. Jean fell into thought, trying to figure out which enemies she was referring to. An image of Reki with a sword came to mind. He remembered that the hero was revered as a savior who had defeated the demon lord. Then he pictured Ryushika and thought about her extraordinary knowledge as the sage. After that, Yuri, the symbol of the saint at the church, appeared in his imagination. He began to feel nervous, realizing that all 3 were now by his side. He thought it was no surprise if this caused discontent among others. His thoughts were interrupted by Reki. She addressed him by name, and she told him he shouldn't worry. He replied to her, but at that moment, Olvold intervened. He said that each of the girls was worth an entire army, and no one would dare to attack. Then His Majesty added that he had wanted to grant them a higher title, but couldn't due to restrictions. He stood up from the table and apologized. Jean immediately stepped forward and hurriedly asked him not to apologize. He said he was already grateful for the opportunity to marry all 3 of them. He added that he couldn't choose just one of them. Jean admitted that he didn't understand politics and that a high title would only complicate matters. Olvold thought for a moment and said that the nobility's discontent could affect the country's governance. Jean walked over to Reki and hugged her. Then he hugged Yuri and Ryushika, pulling all 3 of them close. With a smile, he thanked them for the chance to love each other openly. The girls were embarrassed and blushed. Reki scolded him for the surprise. The sage and the saint looked embarrassed too. Jean smiled and admitted his guilt. Olvold, watching them, laughed, and said that everything was fine with them. He added that he was glad to see Jean and Reki together. Then he declared that the line of heroes would not be broken. Jean and Reki looked at him in surprise. The boy asked what he meant. The king picked up a quill and explained that the hero's blessing is passed down through the blood of the first hero. Everyone was surprised. Reki asked if that meant she was his descendant. Olvold began to explain that, according to the chronicles, the first hero had many descendants to fight the demons. Jean was surprised by such a large number. Reki pressed her fist to her chest with determination and took it as a challenge. Jean awkwardly objected, saying that was impossible. Reki replied that she would settle for a smaller number then. Yuri added that she would go even further and give birth to 21 children. Ryushika stepped forward and confidently declared that she could do just as well and could handle 100. Jean tried to stop them, embarrassed, scolding them that this wasn't an auction. Olvold folded his arms again and said he'd be happy if they were happy. Ryushika crossed her arms and remarked with a squint that behind this might lie a desire to keep future bearers of the hero's power close by. Yuri thought for a moment and said that she now understood why the wedding had been approved so easily. The sage added that there were surely many suitors among the nobility. The king acknowledged their insight, and he said he had turned them all down. He declared that he would not allow the savior of the world to be turned into a political tool. Jean tried to make sense of what he had heard. He realized that a connection with Reki gave a huge advantage. He imagined how many suitors might have vied for it. Ryushika interrupted his thoughts and turned to the saint. She asked how she had managed to obtain the church's permission. Yuri mysteriously put her finger to her lips and said it was a secret. Ryushika looked at her skeptically but didn't press the matter. Meanwhile, Olvold continued, saying that over time, the traces of many descendants of the first hero had been lost. He added that it was a great honor for him to facilitate the marriage of the heroes of the current generation. Reki blushed and said that he was making her feel shy. His Majesty calmly replied that she deserved it. He noted that the kings of the past shared this opinion. Behind him, a large shield hung on the wall, and behind it were 2 crossed swords. It was the symbol of the kingdom. It gave the room a sense of power and ancient history. Jean looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Olvold explained that the hero's wedding attire had been passed down from generation to generation, starting with the very first. He added that all of them were kept in the Mio family's treasury. He sat at the table and looked at it. All 4 were surprised. Jean said that the first hero's attire couldn't have survived all these years. Yuri added that it must have disappeared over the course of thousands of years. She asked if that was possible. Olvold confidently replied that it was. He began to explain that various races had participated in the creation of these relics. He recalled the dragon folk with long, dark bodies and tails, the steel people resembling mighty giants, elves with long hair and pointed ears, beast people with tails and claws, as well as the fish folk living in the ocean. He noted that all races, except for the demons, had contributed. He added that among these relics were the groom's suit and the bride's dress. Reki interrupted him and asked with interest about the wedding rings. Jean looked at her in surprise and asked if she knew about that. She calmly replied that she had seen them before. Jean smiled and said that now a lot of things were becoming clear. The king noted that it had been a very long time since these outfits were last used. Yuri said thoughtfully that uniting all the races, even for the sake of fighting demons, had been extremely difficult, and that the value of these items was immeasurable. Jean asked if he really intended to pass this on to them. Olvold rose from his chair and said that these relics had been created precisely for that purpose. He added that he had already sent messengers to the leaders of all the races. The sage covered her face with her hand and said they would have to wait for a reply. She began to speak of a possible refusal, but the king stopped her with a gesture and declared that he would secure their consent. Ryushika fell silent in surprise. He told them to just prepare for the wedding. She smiled and remarked that he had finally shown some resolve. The king asked her to be quiet, looking embarrassed. Then he addressed her in a joking manner. He asked if Ryushika had made Jean a man and called her by another name, namely Rishja. She reacted sharply and demanded he stop. Olvold backed down and started making excuses, but he continued to tease her. In response, she grabbed him by the collar and threatened him. Jean rushed to intervene and tried to pull them apart. He thought that Ryushika seemed to have known the king since childhood. The saint calmly asked them to stop. Then, with an innocent look, she declared that the first night would be hers. Jean looked at her in surprise. Olvold smirked and said she didn't have enough experience. Yuri confidently replied that she had been preparing, and she had conducted countless imaginary training sessions. The king awkwardly reminded her that she was a saint. She calmly replied that times were changing. Jean watched the scene unfold in utter amazement. He thought this was the first time he'd ever seen Yuri like this. Olvold ended the conversation and suggested they take a walk around the city. He said he had already announced the victory over the Demon Lord, and now there were celebrations underway. Jean agreed. They turned and headed for the exit. Olvold watched them go. He looked at the elf, and for a moment, his thoughts returned to the past. He remembered how, 3 years ago, he had ordered Jean and Reki to go against the Demon Lord. Ryushika had been standing nearby then, looking at them doubtfully. She said that the fate of the world was being entrusted to children. She pointed out that things were bad on the front lines and that they didn't even have an escort. Olvold acknowledged at the time that the situation was dire and said that all they could do was have faith. The girl replied coldly that she had no intention of babysitting them. The memory faded. He saw them again in the present. A voice rang out ahead. Ryushika called out to Reki. She was already rushing forward, drawn by the smells of food. She said excitedly that there must be something delicious there. Jean smiled and suggested that there was a fair going on in town. Yuri laughed and pointed out that they had just eaten. Reki didn't listen and kept hurrying along. Ryushika tried to stop her and reminded her that she should behave with dignity. Olvold watched this unfold and quietly noted that he hadn't expected to see an elf like that. She looked at him in surprise, but at that moment, she lost sight of Reki. Reki immediately ran ahead. The sage called out to her in irritation and blamed the king for it. He calmly replied that she had become softer. She didn't understand what he was talking about. Yuri said with a smile that Ryushika had always been like that. She added that Ryushika only pretended to be strict, though she herself wouldn't mind joining in. The girl blushed. Yuri suggested she catch up with Reki while she stayed with Jean. The elf refused, looking displeased. But just then, Jean said that the smell really did sound delicious, and he wouldn't mind eating either. He held out his hand, inviting them. The girls exchanged glances. Olvold watched them and thought that he had known Ryushika for many years. But this was the first time he'd seen her so happy. A lively scene unfolded before him. Reki ran ahead joyfully. The saint laughed. The elf was still trying to keep a straight face, and Jean walked beside them with a smile. The sight filled him with a sense of calm. After a while, Jean, Reki, Ryushika, and Yuri went out into the city. A festival was taking place in the capital. Houses were decorated with wreaths of flowers, and bright flags fluttered everywhere. The streets were filled with people. Voices, laughter, and music could be heard everywhere. The city was alive with bustling activity. Yuri walked with a light smile. Ryushika also looked happy. A small flower was neatly pinned in her hair. Reki was already holding a treat in her hands and happily eating it as she walked. Jean looked around in admiration and said that it was incredibly crowded here, and he hadn't expected such a grand scale. They walked through the streets. Jean continued to marvel at the number of people and noticed various details. Decorated vases lined the road. Somewhere, drums were playing, flutes were sounding, and music filled the air. People were gathering at the stalls. Some were already celebrating the holiday. Yuri remarked that this was no surprise. Jean agreed and said that it was a celebration in honor of the victory over the Demon Lord. Ryushika, glancing back at Reki, told her not to fall behind. Then she added that people had been waiting a long time for a time of peace. Jean adjusted his cloak and said that now, for sure, he couldn't take it off. A little earlier, they had been standing in the palace corridors. Tall columns stretched upward, and the city was visible below. Ryushika gazed down thoughtfully. The elf noted that the entire capital was now abuzz with talk of the victory. She asked a rhetorical question. What would happen if they appeared in the crowd without cover? Yuri said they wouldn't be able to take a leisurely stroll. Then Ryushika proposed a solution. She showed a cloak with a spell to divert attention woven into the fabric. Jean was surprised and asked what it was. Ryushika explained that anyone who wore it would look like an ordinary passerby, and even their voice would change. Now, as they walked through the streets, she reminded them again that thanks to the cloak, no one would recognize them. Jean noted that they looked like ordinary townspeople. She asked with a satisfied smile if her idea was good. Then she added that many people would be willing to pay a lot of money for such an artifact. She noticed that Reki had gotten dirty again. Reki casually wiped her mouth with the edge of her cloak. Ryushika immediately got upset and started scolding her. Jean tried to calm him down, but he was distracted by a boy who accidentally bumped into him. The boy apologized. Jean turned to him and asked if he was hurt. At that moment, a girl who looked like him, apparently a relative, approached him and urged him on. She said that today they would definitely defeat the Demon Lord. She took his hand and led him further into the crowd. Jean watched them go and fell into thought. He remembered how he used to play hero as a child. Back then, he couldn't have imagined that his friend would actually become a real hero. He watched the children run ahead, and he thought that peaceful days had finally returned. Reki pointed to a counter and suggested they take a look. Hero buns were being sold there. They walked closer. Reki's face was printed on the pastries. She picked one up and said happily that it was cute. Jean noted that there really was a resemblance. The saint agreed as well. Jean turned to the vendor and asked for a bun. Just then, Yuri noticed another counter. They were selling dishes inspired by the image of the saint. She said they looked like steamed buns filled with meat and vegetables. Jean looked at them and wondered, how were these connected to Yuri? He shifted his gaze to her and couldn't help but notice the similarity in their shapes. He felt embarrassed by his thoughts and turned away. Ryushika, meanwhile, pointed to another item. They were selling pencils that supposedly made people smarter. Jean remarked skeptically that it looked suspicious. The salesman heard him and perked up. He said it was a special item that Jean supposedly used. He leaned in closer and began telling strange stories about Jin's exploits. Jean looked at him in bewilderment. Ryushika watched with interest and asked if he liked all this attention. She added that their actions had greatly influenced people. Jean looked out at the city and said he hadn't noticed it before. He realized that people had been supporting them all this time. Yuri agreed and said she hadn't expected such popularity. Reki proudly declared that they had become famous. Jean felt embarrassed and changed the subject. He asked what they had come up with in honor of Ryushika. She walked over to the next counter and picked up a hard, wise man cracker. It looked like a thick flatbread. Jean was surprised. Reki leaned in and said it looked delicious. Yuri remarked with a smile that it perfectly reflected the sage's character, but the sage shot them a disapproving look, broke the cracker in half, and asked what they were implying. Jean decided to intervene in the argument. Ryushika turned to Yuri and asked irritably if she should hold back or not. Jean hurried to stop her and told her to calm down. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully, and began to explain. He said it symbolized her firm and straightforward character, as well as the fact that her opinions were always level-headed and unbiased. His words sounded too harsh. Ryushika froze, her eyes wide. Then she sank to her knees and hung her head. Reki and Yuri exchanged awkward glances. Suddenly, Ryushika jumped up abruptly and shouted that she was going to burn everything down. Jean was taken aback. Reki immediately grabbed her by the arm, trying to stop her. The elf struggled and said she wouldn't calm down until she knocked out that merchant's teeth. Reki tried to calm her down. Yuri just laughed and asked her to calm down a little. Ryushika froze and cast a light spell to suppress her emotions. It worked. She looked exhausted, her gaze becoming vacant. Jean held her as she sat on his lap. The saint leaned toward her and said reproachfully that she should be ashamed of herself. Jean asked Yuri not to provoke her, and added that you can't just beat people up like that. He pulled Ryushika close to him. Ryushika quietly said his name. She looked at him with a languid gaze, tears welling up in her eyes. She asked if he liked girls with flat chests. Jean froze. Memories of the past came flooding back. 6 months ago, he had met Ryushika at the tavern. She was sitting at a table, drinking. He said he rarely saw her there and asked what she was thinking about. She took a sip, and she replied that she had lived a long life and seen a lot. Then she quietly asked why her breasts were smaller than everyone else's. Jean was at a loss for words, and he couldn't find the words. Now he realized that this was important to her. He looked at her seriously, put his arms around her shoulders, and said that he liked any kind of breasts. He added that he loved her just the way she was. He realized how absurd the situation was. They were sitting right in the middle of the market, and the conversation sounded strange. Ryushika lowered her head and quietly asked, "Is that true?" He confirmed it and added that he couldn't stand it when she was sad. He reminded her that she always helped him out and that she was smart and beautiful. He gently touched her hair. Those words made her very embarrassed. She blushed and pressed her hands to her chest, and she couldn't find the words. After a moment, she said that everything was clear to her now. Jean didn't understand what was happening. Soon they found themselves in an alley. Ryushika pressed him against the wall, holding her hand in front of his face. She said he couldn't take his eyes off her. Jean blushed. She leaned closer and asked, "Can't you really take your eyes off such a beauty?" He felt even more embarrassed and didn't understand what was happening. It all clicked in his head. He realized she was reenacting scenes from novels. The elf admitted that she had lived a long life, but she had no experience in love. She said she loved stories like this and wanted to be pursued. Jean realized that her behavior made sense now. It had seemed strange before, but now everything fell into place. Ryushika turned to him again and asked what was wrong with him. She continued speaking in the same tone. Jean looked at her differently and asked a question in return. She didn't get it right away. The next moment, he pinned her against the wall himself. She hadn't expected that. He asked what she felt for him. He lifted her chin, forcing her to look him in the eyes. The girl blushed. All her confidence vanished in an instant. She quietly asked again. Jean continued, and said that he loved her, and now it was her turn to confess. Inside, he felt a strong sense of embarrassment, but he knew he had to see this through. He remembered everything he had been through with her. His gaze softened and deepened. He quietly told her to continue. She was already visibly trembling with embarrassment. Jean leaned closer to her and whispered in her ear for her to say it out loud. His breath brushed against her ear, making her even more flustered. The girl let out a sharp gasp, and, overcome with emotion, she dropped to her knees. All her confidence vanished instantly. She looked at him sheepishly and said it wasn't fair. Jean smirked, crouched down in front of her, and apologized, saying he'd gotten a little carried away. He added that it turned out to be quite fun. At that moment, Reki and Yuri appeared behind them. They saw what was happening and immediately expressed their displeasure. Yuri coldly said that leaving two brides behind for such games was unacceptable and asked Reki if she agreed. Reki replied in the same tone that she completely agreed. The saint gave him a stern look and said they would wait until he did the same to them. Reki supported her words with a grim smile. Both approached Jean from behind and placed their hands on his shoulders. Reki whispered quietly in his ear that everything was clear now. Yuri added that they were waiting, fully prepared. Jean felt sweat break out on his face. He was visibly flustered. Having gotten his reaction, the girls turned away. Yuri exhaled and said it gave her goosebumps. Reki agreed and admitted she'd fallen even more in love with Jean. Jean sat next to Ryushika and said wearily that he didn't understand why he had to go through all this. Passers-by began to take notice of them. The saint approached Ryushika and sternly told her that she wasn't learning anything and was trying to sneak him away again. Ryushika looked at her awkwardly in response. At that moment, one of the passers-by pointed at Yuri and shouted that the saint was right in front of them. The others began to look more closely. Someone noticed Reki and called her the hero, while Ryushika was recognized as the sage. They realized they'd been exposed. A crowd began to gather quickly around them. People were amazed and delighted to see the hero's squad in person. Jean realized it was all because they'd taken off their robes. He hadn't even noticed when it had happened. People began approaching them. One of them asked the saint to say a few words to everyone. She turned toward him awkwardly. Meanwhile, Jean was trying to make his way out of the crowd. He was calling out for Yuri and Reki. Ryushika had also been pulled aside. She tried to stop the people, but they wouldn't listen to her. Jean looked around and saw the crowd carrying the girls further and further away. Soon he was left alone. He realized they had literally been scattered in different directions, and he needed to find them immediately. At that moment, a voice rang out from behind him. Someone called out to him. He turned around immediately and saw a large man. He was standing with his back to him, dressed in dark clothes with a long, light-colored braid. Standing next to him was a small figure, hiding her face. She said discontentedly that he was ignoring her. Jean was confused and didn't understand what was happening. He thought the man was harassing her. He decided the situation was bad and he needed to intervene. He gathered his strength and took a step forward, barely suspecting that standing before him was the Demon Lord's daughter. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.